Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me on this episode of the Morse Code Podcast. Today on the pod, Jason Rosenbaum, political correspondent for St. Louis Public Radio, host of the Politically Speaking podcast, and one of my favorite Instagrammers. We'll get into the reason why. We talked about his upbringing. We talked about a life in Missouri political journalism. We talked about the future of political journalism. We talked about how to stay sane while reporting on Missouri politics. It was a great conversation. And by the way, if you like this podcast, make sure to subscribe because we've got some great guests coming up, including Mike Walk of the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra, Rain Keys of Sweet Art Bakery, Will Smith, the man behind the St. Louis City Foundry. A lot of great guests coming up. Please stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe so you can get all of it on the Morse Code Podcast. Enjoy Jason Rosenbaum. This is exciting. Exciting for me anyway.
Well, it's exciting for me. I do get interviewed somewhat often, but your invitation was intriguing. Plus, I did Mike Carter's show, who's kind of on the right.
Sure.
You're more on the left or the center left spectrum, so I feel like I needed to balance things out.
Yeah. That's interesting. I want to actually hear more about that. But before we get into that, I do feel a little bit on the hot seat because I do not interview people for a living like you do. So we'll see. We'll see how this turns out.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll be slightly above average.
Hey, I'd be fine with that. That's all I'm shooting for. So are you joining us from your house in St. Louis County?
Yes, I am.
Is this the St. Louis Public Radio office? Okay.
This is the Richmond Heights Bureau of the St. Louis Public Radio office.
Excellent. Can we just start out by walking through a little bit of the biographical info, where you're from and how you got here, all that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my biggest shames of being a Missouri political reporter is I'm not actually from Missouri. I'm from suburban Chicago. One of the claims to fame I have over my wife, who actually grew up in actual Chicago, is that I was born in the city of Chicago and she was not. But I was then taken out of the hospital and then into the Chicago suburbs immediately after birth. So I grew up primarily in a town called Buffalo Grove, Illinois. I would say it's comparable to be living in St. Charles County, except more Jewish people live there. I think is the best difference I can put forth.
Okay.
I graduated from Adlai E. Stevenson High School, even though we were named after just an awful presidential candidate. One of the best public high schools in America. I had a class of about 800 or 900 people, and my school had about 4,500 people, which made it the size of a small to medium-sized community college. But both of my parents were born in Missouri. My mom is actually from Kansas City and grew up in Overland Park. My dad actually grew up in Chesterfield before it was the suburban megapolis it is now. It was actually pretty rural back then. So both of them went to the University of Missouri Columbia. I'd always been interested in journalism from a young age, primarily newspaper journalism. And I went to the University of Missouri Columbia from 2002 to 2006, majored in news editorial at the J School, which was sort of the newspaper track, thinking that this was an industry that was never going to run out of money and always be stable. That turned out to be a wrong prediction, but nevertheless, I started my career at the Columbia Daily Tribune in 2006 as their state government reporter. Left that job after about 2.5 years. I freelanced for a little bit. And then I got a job at Missouri Lawyers Media as their web editor in St. Louis. And that's how I came to St. Louis at the very beginning of 2010. Had a couple of like other freelance opportunities after I left Missouri Lawyers Media, and eventually got hired full time by the St. Louis Beacon in 2012. The St. Louis Beacon was an online news publication that was started by a number of people who used to work for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And joining the Beacon started a partnership that lasted for about 7 or 8 years after
Hmm.
the Beacon became part of St. Louis Public Radio in late 2013, and I've been working for St. Louis Public Radio ever since 2013. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about my present day job, but that was a lot of biographical information to dump down. So
Yeah.
have at it.
Well, one thing that I read about you is that I don't know if it's fair to say this is where you got your start, but is where I got my start. We have something in common, which is dabbling in music journalism.
Hmm.
I started in the late '90s. I was writing a column for the Stranger in Seattle, and then the Seattle Weekly, which were their free weekly newspapers, similar to the Riverfront Times. And I saw a little bit that you were doing the same kind of work.
You are very perceptive. I did put that in my bio in at St. Louis Public Radio's website. So what that refers to is when I left Missouri Lawyers Media and started freelancing for a number of publications, I ran across this opportunity to write for the Riverfront Times music section,
Uh-huh.
and the pay was incredible, $20 or $25 per blog post for
Uh-huh.
5 blog posts a week. And a lot of it was like, I don't know, spur of the moment stuff that I just sort of like thought of the day before that was not very deep. But I also got to interview a lot of musicians. Like, I think the best or the most famous person I interviewed was Sharon Von Etten, who
Uh-huh.
I think is still pretty popular.
Yeah,
It
she's
was one of
great.
those situations where somebody's coming to St. Louis, they offer the artist up, and she was really nice. I really enjoyed talking with her. Um, but that did kind of check off a dream I had of doing music journalism.
Uh-huh.
The pay was not great, but that does not justify the horrible experience the Riverfront Times went through last year when
Yeah.
they were bought by like an OnlyFans scraper thing, and
Is that what
it
that
doesn't
was?
really it doesn't really exist anymore. I would
Yeah. Yeah.
suggest people never go to the Riverfront Times website and just go to St. Louis Magazine if you want some of the former writers working there, including Sarah
Sure.
Fensky, Daniel Hill, a number of Ryan Krull. They were
Uh-huh.
all at the Riverfront Times before it kind of went downhill. So I was a very minor part of the Riverfront Times history, but I did feel a lot of sadness when that outlet collapsed for sure.
Did you overlap with Ray Hartman? He must have been might have
I'm
been
not
gone by then.
100% sure. I don't know
Uh-huh.
if Ray was working for St. Louis Magazine at that point in time. So this was like
Okay.
2011, 2012. I
Okay.
think he may not have been at the paper. I have overlapped with Ray when he was on Donnybrook because I am one of the fill-in people, and
Uh-huh.
I've been at the table with Ray before he absconded and ran for office. Absconded
Yeah.
from journalism and ran for office.
Yeah. That is an interesting transition to go from
Yeah, I
journalism to
think so
running.
too. I think you're definitely in the second congressional district, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I I'm as one of the running gags I have is I'm barely in the second congressional district. Like, I was absolutely shocked when I looked at the final map and saw my house was in Ann Wagner's district because I am
Uh-huh.
just so close to the city county line. I can literally walk to the giant
Oh,
Amoco
really?
sign in
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't know. It would have to be a fast walk, but like 10 minutes.
Uh-huh.
There are all sorts of scenarios I thought about with redistricting, and being in the second was not one that had crossed my mind. But you know, I'm just excited to get inundated with lots of mail this cycle because it's apparently a targeted race again.
Yeah.
I don't know if like the district's configuration is going to be beneficial to a Democrat just because it includes like the hardest part of St. Charles and Franklin County, which I think is just very difficult terrain for Democrats. And the other reality is that like Ann Wagner has been challenged pretty seriously several times, and she has been targeted by the DCCC, but she has never lost the St. Louis County portion of her district. So
Yeah.
we'll
Yeah.
have to see if 2026 is the year where Democrats finally go over the edge there. But
Yeah.
basically, like, it doesn't matter how good the candidate is. If like Ann Wagner's winning the St. Louis County part, she wins automatically.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and you know this better than I do that Court Van Osteren got the closest, and then they very intentionally redistricted that district, kind of protect her seat. So it is going to be interesting.
If I
Um,
would say this will be my prediction. If that race is within 5 points, or if the Democrat wins, uh, not only are the Democrats taking the House, it won't even really be close. I think that's a good
yeah.
barometer to look for. Um,
Yeah.
I think it's one of those situations where Democrats don't even necessarily need to win the seat to benefit from it in Missouri.
Hmm.
We I think you experienced this yourself, and that the whole situation about coattails is kind of tricky.
Yeah.
Um, it's it's possible that if there's a really strong campaign in the St. Louis County portion, maybe that benefits like Democratic House candidates that fell short in 2024 in the St. Louis County parts. But you know,
Yeah.
let's not count those chickens before they hatch. We thought that could have happened with Amendment 3, and it didn't, for reasons we may or may not get into. But it is, I'm certainly fascinated by West County's political transformation just because um, my dad is from there and I'm very familiar
Uh-huh.
with the area.
Yeah. I was going to hold off to get into all of that, but I'm not sure I can resist. It was a fascinating experience, and as you mentioned, Amendment 3 being on the ballot, and minimum wage and paid sick leave being on the ballot, and those all passed fairly overwhelmingly, and yet a large majority of people who cast their vote for those policies, and we could go back to Medicaid expansion too, also voted for politicians who had stated their intention and their plan to overturn those. And so just being at the doors, knocking on doors, was a really interesting experience for me, because I would have these great conversations with people, um, and we agreed on so much. We agreed on reproductive rights. We agreed on improved gun safety, and then it would take a good maybe 25 minutes or so until either like out of the blue Fox News talking point would come into the conversation, or sometimes I had some people just say straight to my face, well, I mean, you're a Democrat, so I'm not going to vote for you. um, and to be honest, I mean, people who are regular listeners of this podcast have heard me say this a million times, but um, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to start this podcast, was just because I realized that there's people the people I spoke to, and I'd be really interested in hearing about this from your perspective about journalism as a whole, and then also the region. Um, uh, were more inclined to identify with the talking heads they saw on TV or the posts they read on social media than their neighbors or than the person standing right across from them. And it really made me think a lot about the sense of community, the sense of neighborhood in St. Louis County, as well as more broadly. Um, and I think it also, of course, has implications for local journalism and all of that. Um, it was a fascinating case study.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
And maybe my response will have some more questions to you. I guess I'm turning the tables. Because I this is my perspective on the whole Amendment 3 abortion rights measure and why I wasn't surprised it passed. So I mentioned I'm from suburban Chicago. My former congressman, Mark Kirk, who eventually became a senator and then lost to Tammy Duckworth, was pro-abortion rights his entire career. And it wasn't a situation where it was like a conservative Democrat who gets to the legislature and is generally for abortion restrictions, but not for larger ones. He was just very open. He supported a woman's right to choose. He was not for like abortion restrictions in general. And that kind of dovetailed with the electorate, which was traditionally very Republican, but was more socially liberal on things like abortion, guns, and even LGBTQ rights. But they were not as liberal on like tax issues or
Hmm.
foreign policy issues.
Hmm.
And they still identified as Republicans probably up until like the mid 2010s when there was just a shift where they all were like, yeah, this Republican Party is just way too right wing for me. I'm going to just vote for the Democrats now. And that district is now a plus 20 Democratic district.
Oh, wow.
So I've used that like verbose background is I think that there's a lot of those voters exist in Missouri. Like
Hmm.
they genuinely believe abortion should be legal. There's no argument that the other side can make that's going to make them change their mind. They weren't like fooled by Amendment 3. Like they knew exactly what they were voting for, but
Yeah.
they don't identify as Democrats because they may not like their views on guns. They may not like their views on LGBTQ issues. They may not want to be taxed in a way that like Democrats want to tax them, or they may like, or they may have some misgivings about like the Biden area or foreign policy about Ukraine or anything like that. And that just sort of gave me the sense that voters who are not super politically engaged often just have seemingly very random opinions about things, but it doesn't mean their opinions are any less valid or that
Sure.
it didn't come after they thought about it for a while. Because all the people who I talked with who said they voted for Amendment 3, but also voted for Republican candidates, like they knew exactly why they did those things. And they had very specific reasons for doing it. It may not make a lot of sense to us, but I think we just got to acknowledge that not everybody has, you know, not their political opinions aren't just so uniformly partisan that like they match those talking heads they hear, even if some of their rhetoric kind of echoes it.
Yeah, that's fair. I think I was looking at, and you sort of made reference to it. I was thinking um, that their political opinions were more partisan than I expected because I saw them going in a certain policy direction without abandoning their party. And in my, I'm interested in talking about the region more broadly, but in my district mirrors in a lot of ways the district that you described where you're from. I mean, Town and Country, Des Peres, Creve Coeur, fiscally conservative, socially relatively liberal, not Trumpy, but old school Republicans. Um, and I talked, as I said, I talked to a lot of people who not only shared my views on those policy um, issues that were on the ballot, but also on Trump and the kind of modern Republican Party. Um, but at the end of the day, they weren't going to cast a vote for somebody with a D next to their name, and it was interesting. I didn't see that coming. I really felt like the district was moving away from Trump, and we had in particular, a lot of like, uh, you know, a fairly large base of empowered women voters who I thought were going to be turned off. Um, it was just really, really interesting to witness and kind of be involved with.
Yeah, your district
Yeah,
may be not quite there yet when it comes
yeah. I
to
mean,
flipping to the Democratic side.
yeah,
It would not. I think though the fact that Democrats are even competing strongly in West County, I think is one of the few bright spots of the Missouri Democrats in the last 5 years because I I don't have the numbers in front of me, but like some of these West County districts were like so Republican that Democrats didn't even run for them. And now we're at a
yeah.
point where Chesterfield, I think, at least in 2020, voted for Joe Biden, which I think
Hmm.
would have been unheard of when my dad and grandparents lived there.
Yeah.
Um, but things change, and we'll see what the reaction to Trump 2.0 is in 2 years.
Someone goes into your line of work because they're passionate about certain things, about communities, about equity, equality, a lot of frankly buzzwords that the Democrats have that the Democrats feel like they own. Um, and of course, in the world of political journalism, there's I think an importance of being neutral. I'm not going to ask you any of your political preferences, but
I'm a Whig.
um,
I'm all in for Zachary Taylor if he could be
it's
reincarnated
it's
today.
about time. It's about time somebody
Continue.
stood up for poor Zachary Taylor.
Continue.
uh, you've been doing this over a period of I think it's probably fair to say seismic shift in the state, in the region. Um, you've been reporting on things that have been big changes, and you've been reporting. You know, you I listened to an interview that you did where you're talking about your work during the Michael Brown uprising, and you've been here during a lot of the or through all of the culture war stuff. um, and what's it like to be reporting on that, to you know be present a neutral position, or at least present both sides equally? Kind of what's your approach to that, and how has that been for you on a personal level?
So I will just say that there are some issues where I don't think there is neutrality.
Uh-huh.
You could hypothetically have both sides of racism is bad, but like, why? What is the point of trying to elevate the racism is good side other than just pointing out that there are racist people? Like,
Yeah.
I think that I understand what you're trying to say. I'm not trying to be like critical of your word choice,
No,
but
please.
I think that there are some instances where like being so passive that you ignore obvious truths is not really as acceptable in journalism as it used to be. I think where that came into play, especially, was the Michael Brown protest movement. Um, and I separate this from Michael Brown's shooting and the investigation and the decision not to charge Darren Wilson, which I know is very controversial even to this day. To some other people, it's not controversial because the evidence didn't necessitate charging Darren Wilson. But the protest movement pretty clearly shined a really uncomfortable but needed light on St. Louis and its region's history of racism, segregation, just hostility toward
Yeah.
Black people, which is well documented and is really not disputable.
Mhm.
I mean, Missouri was a slave state for I don't want to say most of its existence, but a significant part of its early existence. And I think acknowledging those things that it happened, all the things I mentioned, slavery, segregation, racism, racial hostility, it may not come off as neutral, but I, I don't really think I don't think you can really like talk about what happened after Michael Brown's death without acknowledging that's why people were there, especially because
Yeah.
I asked them and that's what they told me. So that's
Yeah.
number one. I think what you're trying to get at though is Missouri is like Missouri used to be basically a 50-50 state between Republican and Democrat. You saw that in the presidential level where the state was hotly contested up until 2008. Statewide races were still pretty competitive up until 2016, arguably 2018 because of McCaskill, Josh Hawley.
Mhm.
And now it's just become like super Republican, pretty similar to Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee. Um, I guess to some extent Kentucky, although Kentucky has a Democratic governor. Just states that used to be very Democratic are very competitive that are now very Republican.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so it's not, I guess the way I approach things that are disputable, like I'll give you a better example. There's clearly going to be a dispute about whether like tax cuts are good or bad. Like somebody is going to say they're good because of X, Y, and Z. Others are going to say that they're bad for A, B, and C.
Sure.
So I think that's probably what you mean by like trying to be fair and trying to get both perspectives and also trying to challenge people if they're like using facts and figures that don't add up. But that can get tricky. That sort of thing can get tricky, like with abortion and with like transgender healthcare for minors. Like a lot of this argumentation kind of revolves around people making things that are beyond just opinions. Like with abortion, I think that if somebody is like, I think abortion's wrong and it's morally against my beliefs and it's against my religious beliefs, I, I don't really know how, even if you don't agree with that, that's not a valid perspective because like that's
Sure.
just the way people believe. Same with like if somebody believes it's an inalienable right and that every woman has a right to choose whether they terminate their pregnancy or not, that's an inalienable belief. Where I think where you have to be a little bit more on your toes is just when people start trying to say, well, I think abortion is wrong because of this scientific theory, or I think abortion is right because of this slate of facts. You have to like absorb it and try your best if it doesn't kind of like compute in the split second that it's said, to push back against it in any way you can. So um, yeah, there has been a lot of changes to answer your question more directly. Missouri is not the same state politically as it was when I started in 2006. And I don't see it changing dramatically until Democrats figure out their geographic problem. And you're probably like, what is that geographic problem? Their geographic problem is this, and no one has really disputed this because it's basically just numbers. Democrats will not win another statewide election here if they're getting around 20% of the vote in rural counties, if they are getting blown out in fast growing suburbs that lean more conservatively, like Jefferson County, St. Charles County. Buchanan County is not a suburb, but
Mhm.
Buchanan County, um, even Franklin County, like they're getting Democrats are losing their 75-25. They need to lower that to 60-40.
Yeah.
Um, and then they need to like make sure turnout in St. Louis County, St. Louis City, Boone County, Kansas City is really, really high for them. And they really have to hit all three for them to win statewide elections. And really the only thing they've hit recently, and in some cases they haven't even hit this, is just winning high turnout and high percentage margins in St. Louis and St. Louis County. So they said St. Louis County is like their main bright spot of the Democrats now, but it's not enough to win statewide elections.
Yeah.
So that is
Yeah.
probably a big response to your big response. So I'd be interested
No,
to
that's
hear
great.
your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the geographical problem, and it reminds me of that old line about Pennsylvania being Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Alabama in between. And I think it's way more true in Missouri.
Yeah,
Um,
I would
yeah,
just be careful. Like, I understand that you're saying that because of politics, but as
yeah,
somebody whose mom lived in Arkansas and whose grandma was from Ponca City, Oklahoma, which are very red states, I try my best not to like demean red states just because they're red. I don't think you were doing that. I think you were just
no, no,
explaining
yeah,
the 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 politics there. But like there is a
yeah,
negative association with Alabama and Mississippi among some what I
true,
would feel are
yeah,
less enlightened liberals who just like
yeah,
to call those places like yokel central, which I just
right,
refuse to do for
yeah,
various reasons. But
yeah.
continue.
Well, my whole family's from the South. My grandmother was in Birmingham my whole childhood. My father's from New Orleans. So, but yeah, I appreciate you pointing that out. Um, yeah, I'm glad you made the point that you did about neutrality, because I was actually going to ask you about that, about how you approach your work in a way to present facts without um, betraying a personal bias, but still doing so in a factual way. Because we think a lot. Obviously, it's a hot topic, the topic of neutrality in
Mm.
political journalism right now, because of everything, gesturing broadly, the
Yeah,
world.
and I think that like
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're right, and that's been a big issue since I started
Uh
like
huh.
in journalism school, especially on the right. Like the conservatives have said like mainstream media outlets have been unfair to them for probably decades now. Now I think media has become so fragmented that saying that the media writ large is biased towards one party or the other just doesn't really make a lot of sense because there's so many
Yeah.
different media outlets.
Yeah.
But you I think that most people, if they look at the types of candidates I get on like politically speaking or the politically speaking
Hmm.
hour in St. Louis on the air or get them to call back to me for a story. Like I have a lot of really good productive relationships with Republican politicians in Missouri on pretty much every level. And I think
Hmm.
it's because like I'm upfront with them about what I want. I am usually pretty fair to them in terms of like the sort of things I'm going to ask them. And I mean, I do that for Democrats too. Like, if
Sure.
anytime you come on politically speaking, like you'll know at least the broad topics. You won't know the questions
Yeah.
because I don't even know the questions. But I think that like there, if people who have been on it before or who have interviewed by me, just they know what to expect. They know sort of my weird proclivities and ticks, but they know my track record. I mean, I would hope is pretty good in terms of at least being fair to them.
Yeah. I actually want to talk to you about your weird proclivities and ticks, but one more. Uh, I think, not to belabor this, but it's just so fascinating to me. And um, as someone with a background in writing and a passion for politics, there have been times in my life, times in my career when um, either people have suggested or I've considered um, trying to go more toward political news reporting.
Mm,
Why don't you just do that? Because it's what you're obsessed with anyway. Um, and I realized after a couple tries at it, after writing a few pieces, that I'm too personally passionate about it. I was invested in a certain outcome. It's again another assumption of mine that you don't get into this work and do it for as long as you have without being personally passionate and in the weeds and everything. Um, and so, is that challenging for you to be invested in it without having, presenting it with a personal bias? Or is that just sort of the way that you've learned to navigate it? Just your role is, to present the facts.
I think it depends on the issue. I'll give you an example. There was a St. Louis County bill about like citing people who were like in the street wrong, and it was aimed at like I guess pedestrian safety, but I think it was also like targeted at people who ask for money at stop signs.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I didn't really feel much personal investment in that, honestly,
Uh-huh.
because it was an interesting topic, but it's like I just didn't feel anything. I did make a fun reel about it, and I really showcased that I liked running, but other than that, like that's a good example that came to mind. I think there are just other instances though where it gets very blurry. I've said this before, but I have kids who get special school district services in St. Louis County. That's the reason I live in St. Louis County. We used to live in the city of St. Louis, and when our oldest son was diagnosed with a developmental disability, our doctor was like, you need to go to St. Louis County because they have special school district." And kind of by saying that, was saying like St. Louis public schools were wholly inadequate for special
Uh-huh.
education, which the developmental disability diagnosis was not surprising, but finding that out was genuinely shocking to me.
Hmm.
You know, because it was like a situation where our son was 2 or 3, he wasn't in public school yet. I hadn't spent a lot of time like looking into what the public schools are in the region,
Uh-huh.
and finding out that like so many other people have left St. Louis City for a similar reason. And it's not just the traditional like white flight away from the city, because a lot of Black families who have kids with developmental disabilities who have the means to leave have left.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I've talked with some of them. And, you know, I think what I did with that situation was it really energized me to like talk to people, especially on my podcast, Politically Speaking, or our podcast, about special education disparities in the
Yeah.
city, while always bringing up that personal disclosure. I'm bringing this up where it's like, if you feel like you're in a situation where you may have a conflict, the best thing to do is just to disclose it. Like when
Mhm.
I was talking last year about kind of the labor movement's lurch to the right when it came to politics, especially among trade unions, I said pretty openly that at the time I was part of 2 labor unions,
Uh-huh.
SEIU, because at the time I worked as an adjunct at WashU, and then we unionized at St. Louis Public Radio under CWA. I think that like if you just acknowledge that you're part of unions, like that's probably enough to still report on things that you
Mhm.
find interesting.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's kind of the way you do it. And then there are probably just instances where you just are like, I'm just too personally affected by this, and I'm just going to ask somebody else to do it,
Hmm.
um, which is rarer just because the intersection of personal things that happen in your family life and politics often blur as you get older.
Sure.
Um, but I think just the best way of going about it, where you feel like there's a conflict, is just to disclose the conflict and let other people decide whether you're being fair or not.
You mentioned one of your Instagram reels, which I find delightful. um, and this falls into the category of personal quirks and idiosyncrasies.
Yeah, I'm really
Um,
excited to talk about this.
let's
Seriously.
hear it. Yeah, let's. I mean, there's so much to say.
Oh yeah,
I love your creative output. I also we can talk about how it's representative of the shift in journalism and media, all of it.
yeah, I really appreciate that prompt because I've wanted to talk about the Instagram reels for
Oh,
a
great.
long time with a little bit more depth. Because if you go to my Instagram account, which is a very creative account, it's just my name, Jason Rosenbaum. Um, you'll see all this stuff, and you'll probably be like, "Wait, why? How does he come up with this?" Especially the ones that are kind of interspliced with humor. Are
Uh-huh.
like, where does he have the energy to do this every week? Because
Yeah.
I have a pretty like rigorous internal quota of doing at least one video a week.
Hmm.
Um, so where it came down to was I've always been interested in infusing video into my journalism, going back to when I was at the Columbia Daily Tribune and I had like a point and shoot 3 or 4 or 5 megapixel camera. I think it eventually bumped up to 10. And I would go out and I would just video a lot of like press conferences, and I'd interview Missouri politicians. I interviewed like Sam Page when he was state representative Sam Page, which I go back and look at. I'm like, man, that's trippy that he was a state rep back in the 2000s and now he's county executive. So I'd always been interested in doing that, and I did it pretty heavily early in my career. I didn't really have any like editing skills, and I didn't really have like very good equipment. And then I think when I got to St. Louis and I transitioned to radio, my interest in doing video just kind of went down for a while because I was so
Mhm.
focused on learning audio journalism, and I felt like doing video was just kind of a distraction from that very needed learning experience. In 2022, I was in Hannibal, Missouri, and I was finishing up a lunch at a Mexican restaurant right by the river. I was doing a story about like the 18th senatorial district and how it used to be a very competitive district back in the 2000s, and then it became, oh, I don't know, a 70-30 Republican district, an 80-20 Republican district, depending on where you are. And I just sort of like had this thought process that I'm just going to film myself on the banks of the Mississippi River and be like, I'm doing this story, and be on the lookout for it. And here's a train behind me. And I sent it to our engagement editor, Laura, and she loved it and put it on our Instagram. And that just sort of got the ball rolling on doing video pretty consistently. It started off with me just holding the camera and just talking, kind of just in like long-winded improvised prose. But our photography editor, Brian Munoz, to separate him from Brian Heffernan, who is the editor at St. Louis Public Radio, kind of got, I sort of learned how to use Premiere Pro. He taught me how to use it. And then I was so fascinated by Premiere Pro that I like watched a lot of YouTube videos to learn a bunch of things that were kind of more advanced, like cloning yourself or doing like green screen effects and, doing all sorts of other stuff. And it sort of morphed into situations where I like had like long running gags, and there was like kind of meta stories to some of the videos. And then I would often try to be like, okay, I want to do something on this topic, which is not so serious that I can't be funny with it. Like, how am I going to make this funny? I kid you not, this has been one of the most enjoyable additions to my journalistic repertoire since I started journalism. It has been so much fun to do. It's been a great challenge. And as you said, like a lot of people are getting their news on Instagram or TikTok or other video based social media platforms. I don't know if that's going to continue forever. It may be a fad. It may be something that lasts for as long as we live. But I feel pretty strongly that if you're going to be a journalist in 2025 or even a journalist in 2006, you should go to the places where people are, even
Yeah.
if those platforms are really problematic, and have issues. Like Instagram and TikTok obviously have issues that are you shouldn't skirt around. Like they're very addictive. They often push a lot of content on you that may make you feel angry
Mhm.
or react a lot. I think Twitter did that for a while, and just after a certain point in time, I just found being on Twitter was just useless when the breaking news aspect kind of was broken, and it's not
Yeah.
really a useful tool for following breaking news anymore. Um, so it'll remain to be seen if those platforms can remain what they are, but there's no question that they're extremely popular right now.
Yeah, and just getting away from the platform discussion, it certainly doesn't seem like short form video is going anywhere. I mean, we all came from watching news on TV and we're watching video, longer form video online. I think that it's pretty hardwired into the way we as humans like to consume content.
Oh yeah, I think so too. And it also gave me more appreciation for TV reporters and also uh, videographers or photographers that work for TV stations. It's not that I like disliked local TV reporters, like far from it. A lot of them who I encountered over the last 10 plus years or 15 years in St. Louis have become close acquaintances or close friends. It's just that like if you come from the newspaper part of journalism, you may see TV and think it's shallow,
Uh-huh.
but there's so much work that goes into it. And doing the video stuff really made me appreciate that more.
Yeah, and you talked about you have to go.
No, my sons are
Okay.
here. They were asking me when we're going to the pool, and I'm like, we're going around 3. So feel
Okay.
free to keep that in because that just shows like this is real life.
This is real life. How many kids?
I have
Two?
3 kids,
Three kids.
2
All
boys and a
boys?
girl,
What ages?
11, 7, and 3.
Oh, great. I've
Yeah,
got 16, 13, and twins who are 11. So,
4
yeah.
is more than 3. That is what I've
That's
learned.
so I'm told. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's been yeah, I think like also the to kind of shoehorn that fact set into our prior question.
Yeah.
My middle son Declan has gotten pretty involved in some of my videos, which has been a
Uh-huh.
lot of fun to be a part of. He is very much a stickler when it comes to like what he wants to do or how he wants to frame the camera
Oh,
or what
yeah?
he wants in it. There was a video
Uh-huh.
recently kind of about the Democrats potentially fighting back after the PQs that happened at the end of session, where he
Uh-huh.
demanded that there be spinning cats in it, and I complied. So that's been enjoyable. But you might notice, and this is not really this is probably obvious, but like even though like there are pictures of my kids floating around there, like I always make sure like Declan in particular is wearing a mask because it's
Hmm.
like he's 7.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want my I've kind of become more of the opinion that like keeping your kids generally off social media is probably for the best,
Hmm.
especially if you use it in kind of a work or political context. Like it's not worth it. And we have a lot of masks and a lot of
Yeah.
colorful ones, so we can just do that.
Have you figured out where that line is just for you, what your personal kind of comfort level is as a dad and as a professional? I mean, it's something that I also struggled with or pondered while I was running for office because there's a lot of value in presenting yourself as a three-dimensional human being and in showing what you're like in your personal life, but also you do want to protect them. Where does that line sit for you?
I think it depends. I think acknowledging the fact that I have children is fine. I think that like bringing up frivolous or funny things about them are fine. I think that even the discussion about saying that like my oldest son has a developmental disability was a long discussion about whether I was even going to say that, but just saying that, but not really delving into the specifics, I think is kind of a line.
Hmm.
One of the things that I really like about being a radio reporter, and this may be counterintuitive because I do a lot of social media video and I occasionally get recognized because of that, but um, it might be counterintuitive, but I do kind of enjoy like being out with my family and not being recognized or going to a grocery store and just being by myself and not being accosted because they saw me on TV. Now,
Sure.
when I'm on Donnybrook, every single time somebody stops me and they're like, "Well, I saw you on Donnybrook. You did a good job." And that's always very nice to know. And that's sort of the risk I take for going on Donnybrook. But I think that's kind of that might be a counterintuitive line because journalists, by their nature, are trying to be out in the public conversation and the public sphere. But there does come a point where you also just want to like be out of that public sphere and be in your own comfort zone. So I think it's
Sure.
sort of it's sort of a situational thing, but again, the relative amount of anonymity is one of the reasons I enjoy being a radio reporter, and
Hmm.
probably will not make the permanent transition into TV, but I'm more than happy to appear on TV programs when I'm asked if I need to
Uh-huh.
be.
Yeah. Just one more quick question about the topic of the social media and the video that you've been doing. Have you or has anybody at St. Louis Public Radio seen whether there's an impact from those videos? Are you watching the conversion and whether the ones that have a video attached to them bump up the listenership more, etc.?
I don't know if that those statistics are even possible to do, because the biggest flaw, in my opinion, of Instagram is it is just hostile to linking outside of Instagram. And
Yeah.
TikTok, I think, is the same way. In fact,
Also
it's been,
increasingly hostile to politics.
yes, that has also
Yeah.
been something that's been worrying, because they think they like shifted their algorithm to where like videos like mine are not, they're not suppressed. And I should be point out that Missouri politics is a pretty niche topic,
Yeah.
compared to politics in general. So I was never expecting to make these videos and get a million views every time. They get between like 2,000 and sometimes into the mid tens of thousands, which I think is to be expected. But um, I do think, though, that it kind of like places us in a an online ecosystem that a lot of people are on. And I
Hmm.
think that like one of the tangible things that we at St. Louis Public Radio did that I think was especially helpful is like after the tornado happened, we used Instagram very aggressively to talk about like, you know, information about the recovery or some things that were happening post tornado,
Yeah.
or where you could donate or where you could volunteer, or just showing videos of what the reality was here. And I think that was a real public service. And I know there was one instance where there was a article I did about applying for FEMA aid, where I just sort of
Hmm.
bullet pointed everything that you needed to know. At least one of my colleagues told me that somebody used that to actually apply for FEMA. So that ended up, if it was only one person that did that, and they ended up getting FEMA aid, it was definitely worth that, and it was worth putting on Instagram. So that to me is
Absolutely.
the best metric of success.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate, just as a listener, as a community member who's interested, and then also as someone who has dabbled in local politics. I appreciate that. Um, it makes a pretty dry topic a lot more interesting. And you've also used the videos in the past to sort of preview things, get people to send in questions, and I think that's a really I suspect that's a really effective way of bringing people into the conversation, and it's conversations that touch a lot of people's lives, even though the topic itself may seem dry or boring. And so I think people need to be paying a little bit more attention.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
There's just going to be some issues that are not going to be as exciting as others. Um, Controversy over the unclaimed property tax program was never going to be a super exciting topic, but I tried
Yeah.
my best. And then there's just going to be other things where you just can't use humor. Like
Yeah.
what I found is, and this sort of is backed up for the most part. Um, like if it's a serious topic, I just think like using humor in kind of a random way to get attention is just inappropriate.
Hmm.
Um, there are probably instances where there's some exceptions. I think like when the Amendment 3 proponents turned in all their signatures, I made some joke about how the amount of signatures was either divided by one kid that Drake had, or two, depending on whether you believed Kendrick Lamar's accusations. But that was, and I then like looked into the camera. I'm like, yes, I needed to do that specifically for the algorithm. So that in and of itself was like the reference was like was in and of itself jarring, but then me admitting that I was doing it because I wanted an algorithmic boost was kind of actually the punchline,
Sure.
because
Yeah.
I want to try to keep people off balance sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. It occurred to me as we were talking and as I asked that last question, and it's been a little bit of a thread through this conversation, and it's certainly something that I'm interested in seeing where it goes. And I'll ask it this way: is all politics still local?
Ooh, yeah, that's a great question. Yes and no. I think that
Huh?
state and local politics matter a lot more to people's lives than federal politics in a lot of ways. And there are exceptions, like the fact that members of Congress or the president can invade other countries or potentially draft people is obviously more important than, you know, what the state of Missouri does with its Medicaid program, even if it's very important. But like schools, roads, utilities, um, a lot of the culture war issues that you mentioned are far more dynamic at a state and local level.
Hmm.
The issue is, though, that like information about all those things, for the most part, is just not as highly sought out as national politics, just because national politics has just become so flood the zony, especially in the
Yeah.
era of Trump. But I don't think it. There are instances where like you have to write about like what is happening in Congress or what Trump is doing because there's an intersection. Like, trying to figure out when Trump was going to declare a disaster here in the St. Louis region was really important for a lot of people.
Hmm.
So I do think that politics is local, but I think that like people's attention spans are more national, and that has
Yeah.
trickled down into how people vote for local and state offices, not only here in Missouri, but pretty much everywhere throughout the country.
Yeah. Well, I'll inject some of my own personal opinion, which is that it feels like a large and growing contingent of our locally and state level elected officials are just focused on the national uh, conversation. It feels like so many decisions that are made by the governor, the attorney general, um, definitely our senators, uh, are. It feels to me, and you don't have to comment on this if you don't want to, but it feels to me like they are made for the purpose of currying favor at the federal level, and that concerns me for a bunch of reasons.
I'm going to let that remark go uncommented
That's
by
fine.
me.
Fair enough. But I stand by it. Do you have time for one more or do you have to
I
go?
have time for one more. Yes.
Okay, it might be a little big, but you mentioned Twitter. You invoked the name of Twitter.
Uh huh.
Uh, so this is, I want to find out how it works in Jason Rosenbaum's life, and this is also sort of a personal thing that I've been going through from the time of my campaign. Aftermath of my campaign, of course, meant the era of Trump 2.0. How do you, or what's the secret for staying engaged in political topics, the news of the day, all that kind of thing, without getting dragged down on a personal level? I had to disengage for a
Yeah.
fairly significant chunk of time because I was just like, this is making me into an angry human being.
I actually did. I came up with a segment about that for the
Hmm.
Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air, about how some people were disconnecting from social media
Oh,
outlets
I remember
for
that.
that exact reason. And it was
Yeah.
inspired by me deciding to do that. But our great producer of St. Louis on the Air, Alex Hoyer, was like, you need to find people who have like used it more, because like your experience is not going to be universal. I actually found like 5 people that have actually used it more. So you had kind of both sides on that, even though I was not neutral on that topic. I
Uh-huh.
just do not find a lot of text-based social media platforms to be as useful as they used to be when they were. Um, I think that it is hard. It is hard to turn your brain off to the current event cycle. I've been paying attention to current events since I was like 12 and 13 years old every single day of my life. And not being able to do it can sometimes feel very painful.
Yeah.
I think the way I just sort of redirected things is instead of just being on Twitter all the time, I just go to certain news sites that I find
Mhm.
reputable, either on a local or a national basis. I will admit that when I was following the big, beautiful bill passing, I did have to go back on Twitter and I was like, all right, is it going to pass in the next hour? I just want to know so I can like find something else to do. But you can just go to static news sites and they're going to give you
Sure.
more. They're going to give you the information you need. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think you really need up to the second information unless it is a very specific thing. Like, all right, are they voting on this so I can like stop paying attention to this? That's,
Yeah.
I think, okay. Following it like while you're on a weekend and shopping or with your kids, I think that's where it becomes a problem. And I'm more than guilty of that. And I've tried to back away from it. Um, but I don't see a point where I'll ever stop caring about current events or paying attention to it. I just think you got to
Sure.
find ways to do other things that feel more meaningful
Mhm.
at the time when you're not working, uh, to just give your mind a break. I best. I don't have the answer. I'm not the best person to ask on this because I'm not
Yeah.
very good at it either. So
Does the vitriol that seems to have claimed Twitter, does that make its way onto your feeds at all when you post stuff?
I mean, occasionally, but like I think the benefit of being off Twitter. I mean, I stopped posting in March and I deactivated my main account, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. I have another account that I do log into to view things but don't post.
Uh-huh.
I'm not telling you what it is. It's a secret. Like Mitt Romney had one of
Like
those
Mitt
things.
Romney, yeah.
Yeah. I've become basically Mitt Romney as a social media user. Um, but like when you're away from it a while and you see the vitriol, it kind of is more of like an amusing sideshow than something you're really like affected by,
Uh-huh.
especially if you're not posting and nobody's reacting to you. Like, you just don't really feel much of anything other than amusement, or in some instance, like, wow, that escalated quickly. But
Yeah.
it's, I don't find, I just don't find it to be very useful for my job anymore. Eric Schmid,
Mhm.
who now works at St. Louis Magazine, who
Uh-huh.
used to work at St. Louis Public Radio, was way ahead of the curve on this. And I credit him a lot with telling me, like, I'm not on Twitter anymore. I feel better mentally. You'll feel better once you're off of it. And yeah, I do. Doesn't mean you have to give up social media. Like, you're probably not going to, but
Right.
like, find what makes you mentally comfortable and just go
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah. That's a great place to leave it. Thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate this. I've been looking forward to this interview for a minute.
Game over.